Good morning, everyone. Especially importantly for those of you tuning in, the microphone is critical if you're going to hear me. My name is John Glenn. I'm the Senior Director here at the International Forum for Democratic Studies at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm so pleased to welcome you here for our conversation today on illicit finance, a wake-up call for democracy. This is a conversation that I think in many ways has been supercharged in recent months. Many of the people that are here with us are some of the leading experts, people who've been focusing on this issue for quite some time. Tremendous expertise to it. But I think we all know that one of the side effects, fortunate or unfortunate, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a dramatic shift, I think, in the understanding of the impact of illicit finance and kleptocracy upon democratic institutions and as a means for global authoritarian influence. The remarkable response afterwards was swifter and more unified than I think many of us would have imagined. And yet we all know that the challenge in many ways is still ahead of us, and is not just a challenge in the sphere of Russia, is a global challenge that we need to address here. And that's why I'm particularly excited to have our colleagues and friends here for this conversation. In part, I think I'm really interested in the conversation today to help us do better, to talk about the nature and the impact of this threat upon democracy. So often in the past, it can seem like this, that corruption has been seen as an unfortunate feature sort of human societies from time past. And part of what I'm excited about the work that's done here at the Forum by my colleague Melissa Ayton and by our colleagues who are joining us here is really highlighting the transnational impact of the modern nature of kleptocracy and understanding how it directly affects our democratic institutions and is not, as some like to say, just a nice to have, but a need to have if we're really going to sort of be dealing with a global authoritarian challenge. So with that, I'm really pleased to be joined here in person by Isabella Chase from RUSI, online with Oliver Bullough and Adam Smith. We'll have a conversation that will be moderated by my colleague Bridget Melman, who is NED's Senior Program Officer for Global Programs. I will just very briefly introduce everyone before turning to her, and she will explain to all of you who are tuning on there how we can have you participate and join us, because of course that's a key part of what we're hoping to do today. So if I may, I'll start with Oliver Bullough. Oliver is a longtime friend of the forums and of the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm sure he's well known to all of us who are joining us here, a widely published journalist and author from the UK on books including Moneyland, The Inside Story of Crooks and Kleptocrats Who Rule the World, which was an Economist Book of the Year in 2018. But most recently, his book, Butler to the World, really uncovers and talks about how the UK has often enabled the world's kleptocrats to get away with laundering money, committing crimes. He's written extensively for us. I highly recommend his recent paper, An Offshore Cold War to You, which you can find on NED's website, as well as serving as a guest on our Power 3.0 podcast and contributing to the Journal of Democracy. Isabella Chase, who's here with us in person, is a senior research fellow at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. RUSI is a longtime NED and Forum partner on these issues. She is the research lead on the task force on a transatlantic response to illicit finance, which the Forum's Melissa Ayton also participates in, and on CFCS's Financial Crime Futures team, which looks at the role of technology on these issues. And, let me flag, she is the host of CFCS's podcast, The Suspicious Transaction Report. Finally, we're extremely pleased to be joined as well by Adam Smith. Adam joins us today from Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, LLP, a leading sanctions and trade law firm. But it's really helpful to have Adam join us here today because he previously has also served as senior advisor to the director of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC as it's known in the biz, and on the National Security Council as the director of multilateral affairs. And I think brings to us an understanding of both some of the legal, but also the policy challenges about understanding both what's been done and what we can do, but also hopefully about really the challenges looking ahead, what still is missing and needs to be done. His work has been featured in places like Foreign Affairs, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, and Adam, we're really pleased to have you join us as well. So, thank you very much for being here once again. Let me turn it over to Bridget.
Thanks very much, John. So just very quickly, we'll open up with about a 45-minute discussion and then open to audience Q&As. Those of you who are with us in person, please raise your hands. Those of you who are joining virtually, please drop your questions into the YouTube chat, and we'll be sure to raise them to our guests. So to all of our panelists, to start with, the pressing issue of the day: how has Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed perceptions of the threat and challenge from transnational kleptocracy? Isabella?
Thanks so much, Bridget, and thank you so much to the National Endowment for Democracy for hosting this discussion today and for inviting us to DC. Just quickly a little bit on the CFCS, if you're not familiar with us, we are a London-based think tank that looks at everything at the intersection of finance and security. And as John said, over the past year, we've really been diving into this issue of how illicit finance linked to kleptocracy and corruption impacts democratic societies, especially the US and UK. So Bridget, in response to your question, how has the invasion of Ukraine really changed perceptions? I think, as we all know, it's really sharpened focuses on this topic. Prior to the invasion, I think in the US and the UK, but much more the US than the UK, you did see this sort of increased focus in areas of government on tackling illicit finance. You saw it in the UK in the integrated review and in statements from the Biden administration. But post the invasion, you just see a much wider understanding across society, but across the whole swathe of government, of how important it is to tackle this problem. And it's very encouraging to see it sort of break out of these niche areas. But I think what we've also seen is that need to not only tackle this problem domestically, but to collaborate with allies as widely as possible. And that's really collaboration outside of just the US and the UK, and bringing in the EU, European partners, but then also allies in Canada and Australia.
Thank you, Isabella. And we'll turn to Adam.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, and apologies for not being in person today. I think that's right. I think I agree 100% with what Isabella said, that if there's a silver lining to sort of the invasion, it is that finally, I think that the world has come to sort of become much more aware of these sorts of corrosive elements within sort of the democratic establishment, and the fact that the idea behind what jurisdictions are of most concern regarding illicit finance are perhaps not just the ones we hear most about. The Panama Papers, the sunny places for shady people kind of analysis of of historically, so where people were most concerned, but rather, as Oliver, I think, well knows better than most, that even jurisdictions like the UK, and maybe especially like the UK or the US, are very much enablers of this. And I think unwitting in some respects, maybe witting in other respects. But I think what's interesting also, and I think you're seeing this now, I was fortunate enough to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee last week on this issue. And it became very clear that while a lot has been done, more can be done. And in fact, Congress is now thinking a lot on the US side about more legislation that is possible in order to sort of really sort of knock down these sorts of issues. And so at the end of the day, again, it's very much, it's a bit of a sideline in a way to the war in Ukraine, but perhaps a positive one that I think will live on long after the war hopefully subsides, hopefully soon.
Thanks very much, Adam. And Oliver?
Sorry. I think that's absolutely right, that the war has led to far more focus on kleptocracy as a cause of aggression and instability. Obviously, Russia as one of the, if not actually the poster child for kleptocracy around the world, the fact that it's doing this has made the situation extremely stark. But I think we need to be aware that it's probably become clear by now that not all countries are equally interested in tackling illicit finance as each other. Some of them possibly for slightly sinister reasons. I think the role that Hungary is playing in particular is a bit alarming in terms of acting as a bit of a weak link in the Western alliance. But other countries for entirely understandable reasons. Obviously, many European countries right now, particularly Germany, are far more focused, and Italy as well, are far more focused on the cost of gas and the sort of cost of living crisis than they are on trying to squeeze dirty money out of their economies. I mean, there's only so much political bandwidth. And then some other countries perhaps have been rather more performatively committed to tackling kleptocracy. We learned last week that the Countering Kleptocracy Cell set up in the National Crime Agency here in the UK by Boris Johnson in his speech on February 24th that came as a direct response to Putin's assault on Ukraine. The funding for that new cell, which is supposed to, in Boris Johnson's words, make sure that oligarchs have no place to hide, the funding for that will actually run out in April. So oligarchs will have no place to hide for the next 9 months. And then after that, presumably they'll be fine. In fact, they'll be better than fine, because after that, the National Crime Agency will not only have to find funding for this unit out of its own budget, but will actually have to cut that budget by 20% to fit in with an arbitrary target set by the government. So there are many issues here in trying to hold together a unified Western front against this threat. And I think probably everyone needs to recognize that we will at best end up with a coalition of the not particularly willing, rather than a kind of glorious charge over the top with high morale and everyone shouting hurrah. But that isn't to say that there aren't reasons to be optimistic. I think there very much are. In the past, I would say efforts by the White House to, or the US in general, to drive progress on this issue has been undermined by flaws in the US's own system that other countries have been able to point to. I'd say those flaws have been patched up quite successfully by the Financial Transparency Act, which has helped to, or will, when it finally comes into force, will help to patch up the flaws in the US's own shell companies, which were a source of alarm for many other countries around the world. And then hopefully the Enablers Act will help to patch up various flaws, particularly around sort of the role of financial professionals and legal professionals in being able to move money secretly in the US. And without those flaws, the US will be able to make a far more forceful case to Western allies, which I do think is going to be absolutely crucial if anything's going to happen, particularly in Europe in the next 6, 9 months, 12 months, because of the crisis around the gas price, which is just going to get worse before it gets better. Funding for law enforcement is a key issue that I think needs to be stressed at every point. Often we just talk about what laws need to be passed, and we don't really talk about how they're going to be enforced. I mean, obviously that's been thrown into sharp relief by the revelations about the funding for the National Crime Agency in the UK, but there are issues in all sorts of countries. There have even been issues in the US with concerns about whether FinCEN is sufficiently funded to deal with the very large numbers of suspicious transaction reports which are coming into it at the moment. So, there are issues across the board. And I think the best we can do is to try and hope to chivvy along some of the sort of moderately willing without, possibly giving up for now on the unwilling. I don't think anything is likely to make Hungary do the right thing right now. One thing I do think that's important, though, is not to try and operate as a giant coalition. FATF, a lot of this policy has gone through FATF in the past, which has ended up with everything being so diluted that it's been largely just a sort of box-ticking exercise, very much focused on process rather than outcomes. And I think that's what we need to change. We need to recognize that kleptocracy is not just a sort of, vague evil that's out there somewhere that it would be nice to do something about at some point. It is a real and present threat to not just Ukraine, but to all of us right now. And rolling back the boundaries of kleptocracy, rolling back the loopholes in our own societies, and stopping the enablers in our own societies who are helping that money to come here to buy influence and to commit mischief in our societies is something that we need to be approaching as a matter of extreme urgency. So, we cannot wait, I don't think, for Viktor Orban to see. I'm sorry, I'm giving Hungary a really hard time today, but frankly, I think they deserve it. We can't really wait for them to see the light and start doing the right thing. The few countries that are prepared to move ahead need to move ahead, even if that means that there are only half a dozen of us, because it is too urgent to hang around and wait for others to catch up right now.
Thanks very much, Oliver. So it appears that we've seen an unprecedented rallying of the international community, as John and our panelists have mentioned in the last few months in response to this question of illicit finance. However, our panelists have drawn attention to the challenges, not only in identifying and passing legislation to respond to some of these weaknesses, but also some of the challenges with lapsed funding or the enforcement of those policies. So I suppose turning a bit more focused on democratic societies and on those implications that Oliver alluded to. Isabella, given that the invasion of Ukraine has really pulled into focus just how illicit finance has wielded its influence in democratic societies, including the US and the UK, based on your experience, what are the domestic vulnerabilities of both countries to illicit finance, and how have they responded to these challenges?
Well, thanks so much for that question, Bridget. So yeah, I mean, as John mentioned at the beginning, we have been running this task force, a task force on a transatlantic response to illicit finance, for the past year. Both Adam and Oliver were also involved in it. And our first session of that task force really looked at the domestic vulnerabilities in both countries, because our sort of argument is, if you're going to have a response to this problem, you have to really start at home and understand what are some of the weaknesses in our domestic responses, but also sort of foundations that has really made it so easy for so much of this money to find a home in the UK and the US. And Oliver mentioned a couple of them there. I think really to start off, the main issue is transparency of corporate structures. This has been highlighted time and again and really won't be news to anyone. But we really do need to see movement on this issue quickly. I thought it was just to pick up on one point of Oliver's in terms of the role of FATF in all of this, in trying to raise the basic standards of most countries. Yes, it does dilute the strength of frameworks that need to come in, but at the same time, it's really important to have a basic standard that all countries are supposed to aspire to. And we do see that basic standard in Recommendation 24. The US and the UK have an amazing opportunity to really create a gold standard on those basic frameworks that the FATF tells them to bring in, and at present are lacking and is quite a substantial vulnerability in what we see. Of course, the UK is in the process of strengthening its UBO register. We did, following the invasion, have the introduction of the Economic Crime Act that will bring in our register of overseas ownership, which is long overdue. And we'll see further strengthening to our UBO registers following the second part of the Economic Crime Act that we're expecting in September. The US, of course, is going through its process of bringing in ultimate beneficial ownership transparency. But once we have, on both sides, a bit more reliable transparency on corporate structures, we need to go further and look at vulnerabilities around the ownership of trusts, which is something that hasn't yet sort of got to the front of the conversation when we look at UBO transparency. The second really big area that our task force identified is that vulnerability around the professions, or the so-called enablers. In the UK, again, we do have some supervision of our professional bodies, the lawyers, real estate agents, accountants. But again, to Oliver's point, the supervision of those sectors has been relatively weak. They sort of tend to be overseen by professional bodies or their own sort of trade groups. And within that, you do weaken the strength of supervision because there's a bit of a conflict of interest. I think that will be an interesting thing for the US to think about as it moves forward with things like the Enablers Act or other legislation that could strengthen the supervision of those sectors. And of course, one of the most substantial vulnerabilities that comes from weak supervision of the professions is the phenomenon of reputation laundering, something that I know you guys have done a huge amount of work on at NED and is very important. But when we think about how these actors are influencing democratic societies, it's often once reputations have been cleaned that actors can really start to have a lot more influence. So bringing in checks on those professions like lawyers who are there and to really help cleanse reputations, I think will be a really important step in closing a vulnerability that we see currently. I would say that the final considerable vulnerability that we have, as Oliver said, is really the resourcing of our law enforcement agencies and also supervisors. I think this is a really considerable problem in the UK. Over the past 3 years, through our economic crime plan, we have been seeking to find a sustainable resourcing model for our law enforcement agencies. We have not done that. The economic climate is not getting any better. The challenges and priorities for our law enforcement agencies are going to continue to get worse. And I think an issue that we will come back to in this conversation is around political will. And if political will on this issue wanes, so will the resourcing of our law enforcement agencies and our supervisors for this problem. And then when we also think about how complex the threat is becoming, the sort of prominency of the use of things like cryptocurrencies, we really need to think about how we upskilling our law enforcement response to this problem over time. So I would say those are our sort of 3 big vulnerabilities that we need to be looking at. In terms of how both countries are responding, yes, we've got really good legislation coming through, but again, that needs to be enforced and properly resourced. And it's great to see some of that long-awaited legislation coming. But then also to your final point around what do we need to do as democratic allies, I see what Oliver means in terms of the coalition of the somewhat willing, but I think when we are going to bring together those people who are somewhat willing, what we need to start with is a real sort of step towards honesty in terms of we may be somewhat willing, but we also need to own up to our historic failings in this area, and then also be really realistic about what we can do going forward. Because I think so often we have uneven expectations that we set with allies or third countries on how we can assist in the illicit finance problem. And if we come clean about what we are capable of, how willing we are, we will set a much more sort of realistic expectation of what can be achieved. So that, I think, for me is the most important thing.
Thanks very much, Isabella. So speaking of realistic expectations of what can be achieved, Adam, given the focus of many democracies on sanctions and other financial tools to hold kleptocrats and other corrupt actors accountable, and as well as your own extensive experience in government and within the legal sector, what steps must be taken in order to ensure that sanctions are effective against their targets? And what other measures may be used in order to contribute to a comprehensive response?
It's a great question. And in fact, in some respects, it's the way to answer that question is to look at the vulnerabilities. Because I think if there's an area in which Oliver and I may disagree, it's that I don't think that it would be sufficient to have a coalition of the somewhat willing. Because I think what happens at that point is that you then have lowest common denominator sort of searches, right? So folks that can't necessarily be in the UK or be in the US will look for jurisdictions that are more attractive, be it Hungary or elsewhere for that matter, not to pile on to the folks in Budapest. And I think that's the problem. And so this is where sanctions, I think, can come in. Because what sanctions do, if they're done correctly, is they basically to give people a choice. They say that, okay, if you don't want to, you're unable to sort of engage in laundering of whatever it is in London or New York, and you want to do it somewhere else, that's fine. But if you do it somewhere else where we don't have that jurisdiction, you will forevermore be restricted in your ability to engage in London or in New York, right? So what sanctions are doing is giving people a choice. You can work with those who we don't like, or you can work with us. You can't do both. Once you're on our list, you're not going to be welcome, even if you are able to sort of do so in a quote unquote clean fashion. And that's the challenge, right? So if we're able to put people on those lists, and most importantly, we're able to maintain the attractiveness of London, of New York, of Ottawa, of Canberra, of the jurisdictions that are willing to come alongside, we can then sort of, if not compel, certainly encourage folks to stay on long and short. Because if they don't, and we're unable to sort of really make it worth their while, I think we will see the growth of secondary and tertiary markets, and as what we've of where people can do this sort of activity. And the problem, of course, nowadays is global finance is truly global. It seems a little silly to say, but you can, in the space of a couple of key clicks, move huge sums of money, trusts and other assets from one jurisdiction to the other without much difficulty. And so if you don't have sort of a threat a concern that if you move it from one jurisdiction to another and you're sort of still being corrupt in different jurisdictions, you don't have that sort of thread in place, which sanctions can help provide. You lose track of those funds very, very quickly. And if I may just give you one sort of interesting story, back in 2014, when Russia first invaded Ukraine and Crimea, when I was at OFAC, which is the sanctions agency in the US government, we found this very, very quickly. What Russia was so unique from a US sanctions perspective is not only was it so large as an economic actor compared to any other jurisdiction the US had ever sanctioned, but the players in Russia were so sophisticated in comparison. And so the Byzantine nested ownership structures that you saw in places like Russia, where you had trusts intermediated by different corporate forms, intermediated by other sorts of trusts that were nested in various jurisdictions that bounced around different jurisdictions, made implementation of sanctions incredibly difficult. Because even when you sanction an individual or an entity, tracing who owned what and where was very, very challenging. So much so that OFAC, the agency I worked for, had to change its nature of the way they implemented sanctions. What they had to do is basically expand their assessment of what ownership actually meant. And that sort of was, I think, a precursor to what we're seeing today. And so we're seeing this now as a more and more focus on kleptocracy, more and more focus on oligarchs who are very much at the forefront and continue to be at the forefront of using and leveraging these sort of Byzantine sort of systems. But again, sanctions, if they're used cleverly, and most importantly, if the things sanctions are taking people away from remain attractive, access to the US market, access to the Western markets, then I think they can be a very effective tool in sort of encouraging and even cajoling actors and jurisdictions, frankly, to come online.
Thanks, Adam. And Oliver, you've written extensively on how the UK and the US have enabled illicit finance in your books Butler to the World and in Moneyland. You've also written for the International Forum in an Offshore Cold War about the importance of revitalizing the Transatlantic alliance from the Cold War to combat transnational kleptocracy. Given the discussion of the coalition of the willing, or the not so willing, or the semi-willing, as well as the broad scope of the challenges that Isabella outlined in terms of corporate transparency, professional enablers, reputation laundering, and so on, and the implementation challenges that Adam alluded to, where do you see opportunities for the Transatlantic Alliance to build a holistic and effective response to transnational kleptocracy?
Yeah, thanks. Such fascinating points by Isabella and Adam. I've been scribbling notes here and I can barely read them because I've been writing so fast. Really, really interesting. I thought Adam's point there at the end about the way Russian oligarchs are very, very gifted at hiding, obscuring, obfuscating their ownership of what they own is incredibly well taken. I've spoken to lawyers in the British Virgin Islands and so on who say that when you're dealing with Russian oligarchs, you're dealing with the best when it comes to hiding stuff. But I think to go back to your point about opportunities, there is an opportunity here because it isn't actually the oligarchs doing this. Oligarchs are very good at certain things, stealing stuff, killing people, buying super yachts, staying on the right side of Vladimir Putin, but they're not actually good at structuring incredibly complicated series of offshore corporate structures, trusts, foundations, and so on in multiple different jurisdictions. They have people to do that for them. And that is, to my mind, is the point of vulnerability. That is where we need to hit in that gap between the oligarch and their enablers. And often, too often, those enablers are in major Western countries. If they're not in the US or the UK, they may well be in Austria or in Switzerland or elsewhere. And they can be dissuaded. As Adam makes clear, these are people who are keen to continue to have access to, New York, to Aspen, to San Francisco, and to all the other wonderful places in the US. They're keen to be able to go to the south of France on holiday or to come to London to go shopping. And if those things are denied to them, then that changes their calculations very quickly. If some of them get prosecuted and put in prison, that will change their calculations instantly. None of them want to be that guy at the school gate. That guy, that was the guy who got sent to prison for, hiding the money of that particular billionaire. So that is to my mind, something to hit, really hard that we should be hitting far harder. Yes, there's a lot of rhetoric about hitting enablers, but I haven't seen any real action. It was a little bit heartening to hear, from the counter-kleptocracy cell here in the UK last week that they are investigating 10 different enablers, but I think they have a very broad category of enablers since it appears to include security guards. So I don't think we're talking currently about top-end corporate lawyers structuring empires for oligarchs. I'm just looking at, with regards to the coalition of the somewhat willing, I was being slightly facetious. I agree, but I suppose my point is that it's important to move forward. If only it's important not to wait for everyone, that we need to move forward now in as far as we can move forward and build, progress in as far as we can build it. But we also, I think, need to be aware of the possibility of pushback in our own societies. I received my latest book, Butler to the World, which is about the UK's enabling of skullduggery and misbehaviour. And has been, quite widely well received here in the UK. It's just come out in the US, and I had an absolute stinker of a review in the Wall Street Journal that accused me of having a noted antipathy to capitalism. That essentially I was accused of being a communist. It's quite entertaining because one day later I had a review in a magazine called Socialist Action that accused me of the precise opposite. That was quite funny. But anyway, but the point is that some of the things I'm saying, which I think are good ideas, corporate transparency. Better enforcement of the rules around financial crime, which strike me as being totally non-controversial, but for certain people in the Wall Street Journal reading classes, see those things as being attacks on their right to do business. So we need to be aware that these are not purely non-controversial issues across the political spectrum. There are sadly some people who do very much object to the kind of anti-kleptocracy measures that we are suggesting, because they also could impact on the abilities of some Westerners to make money. And that's something we need to be aware of, that even in our own more or less willing countries, there are some people who are distinctly unwilling.
Thanks very much, Oliver. And delving a bit further into some of your points as well as your writings on this issue, could you share a bit more on how you see enablers and the professional intermediaries that support kleptocrats and their cronies, as how that fits into this conversation of responding to these challenges of transnational illicit finance, and what may be done in order to respond or to combat malign influence?
Because I suppose there's three stages to kleptocracy. There's the initial stage, obviously the stealing of the money in the first place. And then there's the final stage, is the spending or the investing of the money. And then in the middle, you have the hiding and moving of the money, which is what makes it possible for the kleptocrats to remain, in the shadows. That is the bit that is being done by the enablers. And that is the point, therefore, of great vulnerability for the kleptocrats, because that is the point where their wealth is, as it were, in the hands of someone else, of a third party who could be targeted. So not all of those enablers, obviously, are in major Western centres. But work by groups like Global Witness, looking into the legal profession in New York, obviously revelations like the Panama Papers and the revelations about the legal profession in London, as well as the Pandora Papers and so on, and other leaks about what's happening in Switzerland and in other countries, reveals that a substantial amount of that top-end enabling work, I'm not talking about bottom-feeding stuff in Panama, but the real top-end enabling for oligarchs is being done in the major Western financial centres. So they are vulnerable to concerted pressure from regulators and law enforcement bodies. And, certainly at the moment, obviously no one is talking very publicly about it, but I hear a lot at the moment about, as it were, self-sanctioning. People who are refraining from engaging in this kind of work just because they're nervous about being prosecuted. But that kind of nervousness isn't going to last forever without actual prosecution. We do need real work to put some meat on the bones of that nervousness, if that's not a ludicrous metaphor. So that is what I would like to see from Western countries and Western enforcement and regulatory agencies is essentially not to put too fine a point on it, just someone to be made an example of. There have been so many examples of enablers doing, fairly grotesque things over the last decade or two, that it shouldn't be too hard to find someone you wouldn't have thought.
If I may, can I step in?
Absolutely, Adam.
So one thing that I actually am quite hopeful which sounds maybe sort of strange given the way the world is. And the reason I'm hopeful is actually for the experiences that I've seen in the narcotics programming of sanctions. And you might ask, what is the relevance here? Well, the narcotics sanctions program that the U.S. has is the most successful program the U.S. has, and measured in two ways. One, the number of entities that are put on the list, and the number of entities that are taken off the list when their behavior has changed sufficiently. You might say, well, what is the relevance here? The relevance is the reason the narcotics sanctions program is so successful is for the same reason that Oliver just mentioned, that parties that are involved in this sort of activity, be it the kleptocrats themselves, their enablers, want to have a foot in both worlds. They want to have a foot in the quote unquote illegal shadow world and also have a foot in the legal world. And therefore, the thing that you can take away from them, their access to the legal world, their access to Aspen and Miami and London, for want of a better term, is very, very persuasive. Right. So the reason that narcotics traffickers want to cease being narcotics traffickers is they want to continue to have access to that legal world. These are not terrorists or non-state actors that don't need that. They do need that in order to maintain their lifestyle, in order to maintain their own sort of psychic ability to be themselves. Right. They are of the society in London or of the society in New York or Sydney or where have you, and they need to maintain that. So even though this is a very challenging issue, and I don't mean to suggest otherwise, I'm actually fairly hopeful because we do have some experience in the past, at least from the US side, and I think others as well, that if you are focusing on parties that want to have access to the good and the bad, you threaten them with the good, and they all of a sudden start realizing that the bad may not be where they really want to be spending their time. It really is the with us or against us model that I think has demonstrated some success, at least to the counter narcotics program that the US, I think, has done quite successfully.
Thanks very much, Adam. Isabella?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Adam. I mean, I guess one of the interesting problems, though, with kleptocrats versus drugs traffickers is how do you make them demonstrate a change in behavior that would allow them to be removed from the sanctions list? Like, we don't have good off-ramps yet for those oligarchs, and what would be palatable to the people in democratic societies or in the societies that where money has been stolen, to say, well, that's enough, you've done it, you can come off the list now. So that will be a very interesting question for policymakers to grapple with over the next months and years. Agreed. And I think we can agree that there needs to be an off-ramp, right? Because if we come up with the decision that these people are completely irredeemable, I don't think that that is going to be an effective strategy. They may be irredeemable, right? Some of them might be, and then they wouldn't get off the list. But I do think there need to at least be some poster children for folks who have been able to make, compensation and being able to sort of demonstrate their wrongs and do the appropriate mea culpa. We have to have that, because if we don't have that, my fear is that no matter what solution, basically you're just putting them in a room and say that, fine, you can go and spend time in these jurisdictions and just do what you want to do. And the problem is that our societies are so permeable that if you do bad in some jurisdiction, it will eventually leak into ours anyway. Maybe not as directly, but we do need to figure out a way to sort of make it worth their while to behave in the way we would like them to, and therefore reap the benefits of that good behavior.
Isabella, a substantial part of this conversation has focused on the need for transatlantic cooperation in responding to these challenges. And of course, we're all familiar with the special relationship between the US and the UK, as well as Europe and beyond in some of the examples that have been given of responding to other issues of illicit finance. I wonder if you could share a bit on what you see as the priority areas for action among democratic allies in the US and Europe and beyond to tackle the global nature of this challenge, and in particular, some of the hurdles or obstacles that these actors may need to overcome in order to do so. So we'll start with Isabella, and then keen to hear Adam and Oliver's insights as well.
Sure, thanks so much, Bridget. I think in terms of priority action areas, I think sanctions has to be the top of the list. As Adam has alluded to, sanctions are strongest when implemented in the most coordinated fashion. And of course, we have seen a lot of that in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Of course, sanctions implementation is more than having the same names on a list. you have to also then enforce those sanctions. And that, I think, leads into the point that Oliver's been making around political will. I think we see uneven political will across the three countries, or the three regions, sorry. And you have different levels of capacity to enforce. Just on, I guess, the political will point, there's just so many tensions, right? So the US has been quite strong on this point. In the UK, as many people are aware, we're having our own political upheaval moment, which has a huge amount of uncertainty. Boris Johnson has had some clear direction on how to respond to this to transatlantic kleptocracy, but what would the next prime minister do is still really unclear. And we'll also have to build relationships with the US. In terms of the EU, there's still a lot of frictions between the UK and the EU related to Brexit, which are difficult, which creates a lot of difficulties and hurdles on things like information sharing, cooperation, on sanctions. There's still just a lot of friction there. So I think when it comes to working together in a response, we have to be quite practical about there are political issues that are creating hurdles. And that is shown in sanctions, but also in other areas. I think, where would I love to see more priority placed in greater information sharing between the three? I mean, we have seen through various task forces that have been set up in the response, much greater information sharing on networks and assets, but how do we solidify that to ensure that it is continued past this particular crisis, I think will be really important. But then sort of coming up against a bit what Oliver was saying, there's lots of, again, practical considerations. People have different data privacy and information sharing cultures that we need to be contended with. And I think sometimes we can sit in our policymaking circles and say, well, you need to do this, this, and this, and be really ambitious here. But then sometimes what we're asking for does begin to encroach slightly on the democratic values that we're trying to protect. To Oliver's criticism that he received, he really believes that UBO transparency is really important. I mean, I completely agree with him, but of course there are people who sit in democratic societies who completely disagree with him. So I think there are also those hurdles that we're coming up against.
Thanks very much. And Adam, how about your view from this side of the pond?
Yeah, I think we've got to recognize how far we've come. What I mean by that is that if you look at the Russian incursion in 2014 and the result of sort of the sanctions and other sort of related actions that occurred after that, that was much more of a pulling teeth exercise, to be perfectly honest, between the US and the EU at the time, which of course included the UK. It was a very challenging exercise to get the EU on board. I spent a lot of time in London, a lot of time in Brussels, trying to sort of forge some sort of parallel process. And frankly, it really wasn't until the Malaysian airliner was shot down over Ukraine, which of course included a lot of Dutch citizens, that the EU finally really got on board. And even then, it was still very much push and pull. And then after that, of course, it really sort of died down. In fact, so much so that obviously, by 2022, yes, there were still sanctions in place, but they were really very much a shadow of what they frankly could have been and maybe should have been. So what we've seen now with the Biden administration, the EU team, and of course the UK team under Johnson at the time, getting a lot of credit for this, really establishing a multilateral front of sort of similarity of political outcome, at least desire for political outcome. I think you've seen that across, broadly speaking, the EU, the G7, and broader, even G20 countries in some cases, with the Australians and others involved as well. So I think I just want to sort of pause and sort of say that we've come a long way, but there's still a lot to happen. And I think you're right, Isabella. I mean, in some respects, it's really nuts and bolts, right? You do have the political will issues, the big ticket items that Oliver sort of mentioned. But really, one of the things I found so challenging when I was in government was information sharing, that there was some challenges sharing outside of the UK, right? That's quote unquote special relationship is really special in many respects, and information sharing is one of them. And sharing it into the broader EU community, even amongst NATO allies, it can be challenging. And so solving those sorts of problems, I think, are sort of going to be critical. And I think that there's been a lot of movement forward. And again, I just want to sort of pause and sort of not pat ourselves on the back, but say that we are pretty far more advanced in this context than we were even just 8 years ago, back in 2014. But I think more can be done on those lines, right? Sort of making sure the multilateralization remains key, and the multilateralization not just of announcements with respect to who is on the list, as you say, but then what do we do once they're on that list? And of course, bringing in players that have historically not been involved are going to be critical too, be it the Swiss, be it the Singaporeans, and others that sort of have sort of joined the party in this regard, which have been very, very helpful. So again, we've come a long way, but all that we've done, we just need to do more of it with respect to multilateralization and sort of the sanctions part 1, part 2, which is, the day 1, day 2. After you name, what do you do to enforce? What do you do to continue the pressure?
Thanks very much, Adam. Oliver, do you have any thoughts to add?
Not really, but I mean, fascinating points. I think again, just I think worth reiterating what Adam was saying, that though it does look, some of the obstacles ahead do look insuperable, it is kind of amazing how far we've come. Actually, the response has been huge, and I think hugely surprising to the Kremlin. I don't think he anticipated that the West would act with the degree of resolve and unity that it has. And I suppose a challenge is to try and maintain that, and not just maintain it, but build on it. And I'm glad, frankly, that it's not me who's doing that job. Of course, worth bearing in mind that, the kleptocracy does not equal Russia. There is a far broader problem out there, though Russia may be, the sort of most perhaps egregious example. Other countries operate in exactly the same way. And we need to try and learn the lessons of what we failed to do with regard to Russia in terms of not acting proactively and only acting reactively after it invaded Ukraine, but to try and act proactively next time. Obviously, China is sort of the great elephant in the room. Chinese money laundering happens on a scale and an ambition and in a sort of entrepreneurialness, if that's a word, which puts Russian money laundering in the shade. So, it not meaning to make it look like that yes, we're cheering that we've scaled this mountain, but look at that mountain over there, isn't it so much bigger? But hopefully some of the lessons we've learned from this can be moved across and to try and build an international coalition to tackle kleptocracy in the round, and not just the particularly grim Russian iteration of it.
If I may, there's one other thing I want to be sure that we're aware of, and that is the risk of sort of over-response. What I mean by that is that what's interesting about all of these tools, sanctions is the one I'm most familiar with, but really all of the regulatory tools we're talking about, is that they are implemented by governments, or at least promulgated by them, but then implemented by the private sector, right? The private sector are the ones on the front lines providing services to kleptocrats or otherwise engaging with kleptocrats or oligarchs or otherwise. And what you're seeing in Russia, one of the positives and negatives is this sort of self-sanctioning that Oliver mentioned. And even though there's definitely a positive side to that, it's also the case that, at least in the US, this was not expected, right? This was not a part of sort of the sanctions program that had been set out really in sort of excruciating detail since November. Rather, when all of these companies and entities started leaving Russia, the impact on the Russian economy and arguably kleptocrats and others that are sort of relying upon sort of continued largesse from the West into Russia was significantly greater than sanctions were designed to. But therefore, it's also significantly greater than perhaps it was designed to for a reason, right? The whole idea is to be surgical and limited and to be able to sort of have these off-ramps that we were talking about. And if the private sector is unwilling to provide these off-ramps, because even if sanctions were relieved, for example, they'd be less willing to go back in, you have a real impact with the ability then to sort of provide sort of the carrot to the stick with respect to sort of making sure people behave in the right way. If people are not going to do business with you anyway, what's your benefit of sort of going back in? And you see this not with respect to, not just with respect to kleptocrats, you see this in very negative ways, as we've seen sort of in the charitable context, where charities have a very hard time, legitimate charities, finding banking partners, for example, for fear of money laundering, for fear of what happens when charity money gets to Somalia or gets to Ukraine, for that matter. And so this is what we need to be concerned about, is sort of an overreaction on behalf of the private sector. You might say, well, we're so far away from that, we shouldn't worry about it. But I think there's a tipping point there that I'm very concerned about, because you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And my concern is that if we make rules so great, so restrictive, and consequences so draconian, you're going to get an overreaction that might actually that we're down to our detriment as well as to our benefit. And I think that's one of the things we need to think through.
Thank you all very much for this very wide-ranging discussion. There's been quite a lot of issues from the past learnings and how far we've come in international cooperation on this issue, to the challenges, obstacles, and opportunities that lay ahead of us. We'll open it up now to questions from our audience, both in person and virtually. For those of you who are speaking in person, please start by introducing yourself before posing your question. I see Tom in the front row. And then Stan.
Hi, yes, good morning. My name's Tom Keating. I am a colleague of Isabella's at RUSI. I have a question for all the panelists. So the third part of the tariff task force program happened just after the further invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And we focused very much on perhaps less the issue of criminal finance, but more on the way in which finance, whether it's criminal or not, is kind of directed to undermine democracies. And for me, that's perhaps the wake-up call that we've experienced in recent months, maybe in the past year, is that actually, whilst we're looking for criminal finance, and we should absolutely continue to look for criminal finance and close loopholes, there is finance which comes into our countries, which isn't necessarily on the face of it criminal, but has malign intent. And so I guess the question to all three of you from your different perspectives is, first of all, is that a reasonable threat to be concerned about? And secondly, what should we be doing about that kind of finance? Because it seems to me that our system is not set up at the moment to really grapple with that, feel like clean money with bad intent.
Can I ask a question back to Tom, actually? What do you mean by that? What is the bad intent we're talking about? I'm not sure I understand exactly.
So for example, I mean, a particular issue in the UK, and I suspect in the United States, but I can't say for certain, is donations made to cultural institutions, political parties, which are willingly accepted. And often what you hear is, oh, we did all the checks, the money was completely legitimate. And that's probably a reasonable response by the aforementioned political party or National Gallery. However, no one has stopped to think, yes, but what comes with that donation? Well, what comes with that donation is joining the board and then getting invited to Downing Street or whatever it happens to be. So the money is probably legitimately earned, but there will be an intent behind that donation, which is not simply, I love art.
Would any of our panelists like to take that first?
I mean, I can talk about that a little bit. I mean, it's interesting, obviously with the cases like that of money going to to that political party or whichever, then, there are clearly questions to be asked. But, I think in a way this mirrors some of the issues we've had with talking about money laundering over the years. Obviously, back in the late 80s, money laundering began as an issue primarily talking about money from the narcotics trafficking. And then after 9/11, so, that's about making dirty money clean. And then after 9/11, it became talking about terrorist financing, which is about, as you're talking about, Tom, making clean money dirty. And then now we're talking about kleptocratic money, which is talking about money that's kind of clean in one country and dirty in another. It all gets very difficult when you get these very muddy definitions. So I suppose I would rather that we just focused on the lowest of low-hanging fruit. I feel that there's a lot of it around at the moment without worrying too much about the more difficult issues such as influence buying and so on, when there is so much sort of raw criminality in the economy at the moment. And perhaps when we've solved that, we can worry about the more marginal issues. I certainly would think, however, though, that those kind of issues, these influence buying operations by oligarchs and so on, is more a question for sort of intelligence agencies perhaps than it is for law enforcement anyway.
Thank you, Oliver. Adam, Isabella?
I mean, unfortunately, from a U.S. perspective, I think we are hampered in really cutting down on it. Because I guess what you're talking about, Tom, in a way, is sort of political money, in a way, right, rather than sort of criminal money, political money writ large, buying influence or whatnot. And as I'm sure many of you know, certainly in the U.S., the Supreme Court has become very clear that political money has very few restrictions. Political money is a form of speech. And that's a real challenge from the U.S. perspective. So, not that I don't think this is an issue. I sort of feel sort of like Oliver's thinking that we can, if we lose our focus by looking at all of the issues, that we might lose our focus on all of the issues rather than sort of focus on perhaps low hanging fruit. Not that the other ones aren't particularly low, are that easy to sort of deal with. This one, from a U.S. perspective, which I think is one of the, not that there aren't issues in the UK and all the rest, I'm concerned that it's a more challenging exercise that sort of requires changes in legislation and even constitutional understanding before we can really address it.
Yeah, and just a bit more, I suppose, on the UK perspective, I think it is something that our government is becoming much more aware of and just conscious of the ways in which this type of clean money can have negative influences. We recently introduced a new statutory instrument which allows the government to have the ability to question investments in certain sectors which are sensitive. And so I think those types of activities are useful to check the initial understanding of the threat, but I think it is really important to monitor because although complex and challenging, I don't think it should be left unexamined. And I think obviously very complicated in the UK, US, but I think I'm probably quite concerned about it also in sort of third countries outside of a Russian threat, thinking more from a Chinese perspective of how that country is putting other countries in very awkward positions in the way that they have financed infrastructure projects and the like, could be very troubling in the future. So I think I would agree, yes, there's probably easier fruit to pick, but let's not ignore this one at the top of the tree because it could one day become quite bad.
Thanks very much. Chris?
So first of all, Chris Walker at the National Endowment for Democracy. I'd like to compliment all the speakers for a really thoughtful and informative discussion. I'd like to supplement Tom Keating's question relating to resources that come into open societies that aren't explicitly illegal. And that is to say that they won't be they won't be the focal point of agencies, law enforcement, and the like, but nevertheless may have negative externalities or otherwise exert malign effect on open societies. And universities are one aspect of this, cultural institutions, and there are others beyond the explicitly political realm where this kind of impact is being seen. You can see this in an increasing number of reports where there's supporting evidence to suggest this kind of effect. And my question is, we're in an age now where societal resilience won't come only from governmental actors and official agencies, but from other parts of society in the non-governmental sector. So I'd ask the panelists to talk a little bit about what else the non-governmental sector needs to do beyond what it's doing to date to deal with these increasingly complex effects that go beyond the explicitly illegal, whether it's coming from China, Russia, the Gulf states, or other such places into open societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Isabella, Adam, Oliver?
I can start a little bit. What you're sort of seeing, and I think this is the challenge, you look at the China example, the Confucius Institute sort of examples, which I think, have been in universities and all the rest. If I'm not mistaken, there are some jurisdictions, I think Australia might be one of them, that have shut down all of the Confucius Institutes. The first jurisdiction, if I'm not mistaken, that's done that. And that's, I think, maybe the quintessential example of sort of the clean money for potentially malign effect, maybe long-term malign effect, but certainly malign effect. But the problem with that, of course, is not just, it's overshooting, right, from the perspective of there's a lot about Chinese culture that is completely benign and fascinating, and it would be good to sort of expose people to. But on top of that, money is like water. It's a little bit of a trite statement, but it is. And so long as the Australians, for example, rely upon China for a huge portion of their trade, it's not clear to me that shutting down Confucius institutes at the University of Adelaide is necessarily going to sort of limit that sort of malign flow. It'll just redirect it and maybe make it a little less concentrated or otherwise. And so that's sort of the challenge. And in fact, one of the issues, to go back to the initial question, what is the vulnerability? The vulnerability is the vulnerability of open societies, right? We are an open society from an information perspective and a financial perspective. And that's one of our great benefits, right? That's what's made the West, I think, free societies so successful. And frankly, such a wonderful places to live in a way. And I think the concern is that if you were to shut down and really bifurcate the world into sort of the good and the bad, I think you lose a lot of sort of, actual benefit from that. And I think that's the real issue. So yes, there's more that can be done. And I think what the Australians have done, for example, is sort of an example of that. But it's not clear to me whether that's a real solution. Any more than actually shutting off all Chinese funds, for example, on the border of Australia, which I don't necessarily think is an option either. So I do think that this is a challenge. Not that it's not one we shouldn't be thinking about. I just don't know if there's an easy solution that is consistent with the openness of our societies.
And I think, especially to that point, given the breadth and complexity of the international financial system, Isabella and Oliver, if you could comment sort of specifically on the context of the response to transnational kleptocracy and illicit financial flows per Chris's question.
Well, I suppose from my perspective, one of the enduring difficulties with dealing with particularly Russia, but I think China as well, to an extent, is their skill and willingness to engage in sort of information games to try and undermine the unity of the Western coalition from within. Obviously, we've seen them interfering in elections, but also the sort of the disinformation space, or the use of television channels like RT. I think its influence is overstated, but it still has a certain amount of influence. So I suppose one really important point, which I think all of us need to remember, is that we just need to keep stressing that these people are not stalwart, upholders of family values and conservative order, or whatever Putin is presenting himself as, but he's a thief and a murderer, and a really grotesque one at that. And the same is true of all kleptocrats, really, wherever they're from. So, continuing to do the work and encourage the work by, the human rights groups on the ground in Xinjiang or in Russia, or continuing to support the work of investigative journalists in Russia or Ukraine or elsewhere and so on, just to tell the truth about what these regimes are like, because otherwise, often their version of the story is what people hear, and then the whole truth about what's going on with transnational kleptocracy gets muddied, because it's difficult to convince people that kleptocracy is a threat if they don't even think that the people stealing the money in the first place are corrupt. And it sounds like a sort of a small thing, but actually it's something that you need to keep working at all the time. And obviously part of that is books like Catherine Belton's book about Putin and so on. That kind of really detailed, years and years long investigative work. But a lot of it is more journalistic or more NGO based. And that is something which perhaps we when we talk about UBOs and other three-letter acronyms and these very complicated and quite sort of involved aspects of offshore finance, it's possibly easy to forget sometimes that what we're really talking about is theft and murder on a massive scale, and that all the sort of offshore skullduggery is just ways of obfuscating that. And we need to keep remembering that we need to keep talking about, as it were, the predicate offence and not just the money laundering bit.
Thank you, Oliver. Isabella?
Well, I completely agree with that. I think education is such an important step because it gets rid of complacency. To the original question, I remember there was an investigation into UK universities a couple of years ago with a huge amount of questionable money going to pay fees. And once it was brought to the attention of these universities that this money is not coming from a reputable source or anything that you would want to be associated with, they then very quickly sort of went back to their controls, went back to their banking partners and established better compliance programs. But they were just being complacent initially. So I think through the work of journalists or a whole different range of non-governmental groups, you can, as Oliver says, really bring to life, why is this so bad? Communicate that to the people who need to know about it and eradicate some of that complacency, because ultimately you can't regulate everyone. We can't, as to Adam's point, we live in an open society. We can't say that absolutely everyone has to be reporting on this threat and be conscious of it all the time, because that's not what we want to live in. You also just wouldn't have the capacity to supervise it. But that's going back to sort of boring technical points. So yeah, I think that is very important just to remember what is the human harm of all this, and do people know that? Because I think there's still a lot of work to be done there.
And I think one of the challenges is this what you're saying, Isabella, the education piece, because one of the things we see that's new, even just in the past 10 years, is the information space, right? The fact that the kleptocracy that is governing Russia also manages to have a almost complete monopoly over the information space in the Russian-speaking world. Makes it very difficult for this education, because the history here is that the way to solve this, quote unquote, on a long-term basis is not just to put the barriers up and the consequences up in places like London and New York, but it's to get people in the countries that are supposedly benefiting, right, the Russians themselves, to understand that they're being murdered, to understand that they're being stolen from, and to rise up and to do something about that. That seems to be, through their own sort of democratic processes or otherwise. Historically, that's how you solve this problem on a long-term basis. But my concern is that it's very hard to do nowadays because of the control of the information space. And China, of course, is even more extreme. And so how you get that education, because who, when you say, Isabella, who needs to know? It's not just the people on the streets of London and New York need to know about the corrosive components to their own democracy. That's important. That doesn't stop the flow. What would stop the flow is to stop, as Oliver said, the predicate offenses. And the predicate offenses can only be stopped really by the people who are, quote unquote, benefiting from those offenses, which I'm concerned is much more challenging so long as RT is the CNN of Moscow. And this, I can't remember the name of the Chinese version, but there's this CTV, I think it is, in Beijing. I think that's part of the challenge, is the information space that's a part of this fight that is very challenging to sort of break through.
Thanks very much. I see a few more questions from our audience.
Thanks, Bridget. We have a couple questions from our virtual attendees, so I might ask them both at the same time if I could to the panelists. The first one says, in respect to the important this question's in respect to the important role technology plays in reducing the prevalence and impact of illicit finance. Can any of the panelists please speak to the potential of central bank digital currencies and whether they may help? And our second question from our virtual audience asks, what are the repercussions of kleptocracy specifically for human rights? And how are governments responding to these challenges?
Oliver, Adam, Isabella?
I think the central bank digital currency is a really fascinating one. Actually, it seems like an actually genuinely potentially useful use for a blockchain, which is verging on unique. I did an article towards the end of last year about what's called in Britain anyway, the cash paradox, possibly the banknote paradox. The fact that over the last 15, 20 years, the use of paper money has been declining in all major Western economies. Declining very steeply as obviously people use, buy things online or use debit cards or whatever instead. And yet, at the same time, the issuance of paper money has been going up and up and up to astonishing degrees of 10% a year. Incredible, outstanding volumes of all major currencies, and particularly dollars and euros, and overwhelmingly in very large denominations. And this is almost certainly being used as the raw material for money laundering on an industrial scale. Central bank digital currencies would solve that problem, which is amazing. They would cause other problems. There are people who need cash, people who don't have access to the banking system, people who, particularly older people who rely on cash, who don't want to learn a whole new way of paying for things. And that needs to be helped and needs to be sorted out. But I do think that, central bank digital currencies are a potentially transformative blow against the entire global criminal economy. However, as with all forms of major technological change, there's a plus side and a negative side. They could also be an unrivaled tool of government control over the population and a way of surveilling people doing entirely lawful things they don't want other people to know about in an entirely legitimate way. And that is a balance that, as a democratic society, we are going to have to discuss. Do we want to, is getting rid of criminality a price worth paying for the government knowing literally everything we're doing with our money all the time? I think for quite a lot of people that won't be a price that they think is worth paying. Certainly across large parts of continental Europe, where cash usage is far higher still than it is in the US or the UK. However, I suspect in China, where democratic discussion isn't quite so developed, I think they'll be moving ahead and thinking that is a price worth paying. But so it is a fascinating tool and has that sort of utopian quality of being simultaneously amazing and absolutely terrifying at the same time.
Adam, Isabella?
I think that Oliver encapsulated a lot of the points on CBDCs there. But I would say that more broadly, technology does have a very wide role to play in tackling the illicit finance problem. The US and the UK currently have a joint prize between Treasury and HMT and the US Treasury. Looking at how privacy-enhancing technologies can be used to combat illicit finance in the round. And I think it's important when we think about how can technology be used to think outside of just the really exciting sort of sexy CBDCs and blockchain-based technologies. We have others as well that can be really useful in either enabling anonymized information sharing that overcomes some of the cultural hurdles that we discussed earlier, but also just, maybe just use some really big data analytics to better identify networks between in huge databases. There are lots of applications that are possible and don't have to be quite so sort of terrifying sometimes as CBDCs.
Yeah, and I mean, just like Isabella was saying, I mean, the problem in some respects is almost too much information. And so what you sort of need when you're trying to track down bad money and then try to separate it from bad money from good is sort of machine learning, artificial intelligence. These sorts of uses of technology, I think, are very promising. Some articles just in the past few weeks on big banks sort of trying to leverage into artificial intelligence to sort of increase their compliance sort of throw weight. Which I think is an important sort of use of these sort of technologies and deals with, again, the fundamental issue of sort of too much information in some respects rather than not enough.
Thanks very much. So we're approaching the end of the event, so let's do one more round of questions. I see several hands up in the room. Ryan, do we have any other questions online? No? Okay, so I think I see 3 hands in the room.
Thanks. Thanks so much for a really fascinating discussion. I'm Adam Fivenson. I'm the Senior Program Officer for InfoSpace Integrity, so very interested in the conversation of the role of the information space in facilitating kleptocracy. And so just a dual-barreled question here, and I'd love to start with Isabella, since we heard a little bit on this from Adam and Oliver before. But so just, in terms of the role of disinformation in facilitating kleptocracy, is this really purely a question of political will, or rather impacting political will, impacting prioritization among populations, or is there more to this sort of nexus of controlling the information space and facilitating this sort of transnational corruption? So that's kind of part one. And then the second part is building on Chris's question, which is to ask, what is the role of civil society in really pushing back? Is it about purely naming and shaming and maybe some policy advocacy around sanctions? Or again, is there something else there that we should be aware of or thinking about? So I'll stop there and pass it to Eric.
Sure, thanks a lot. Eric Robinson, Associate Director of the Africa Program here at the Endowment. I'll make just 2 or 3 quick points. One is that I think the question that was asked online about human rights and the connection was not addressed. And I think that goes to Adam's civil society question here, and something I often hear in fora like this, where we talk about a lot of the highline policy issues, we talk about big task forces, we talk about transatlantic issues, but we often forget about the people. We talk about the corrosive impact, not just on broader societal level, but on people and on societies. In Africa, it's the illicit finance. You can't say that without illicit financial flow, and it tends to be in one direction. And one of the things we're very excited about in Africa is the momentum we're seeing globally around the world to get serious about this issue and to be able to tackle beneficial ownership and to untangle the spider webs. So this is incredibly valuable. We're very excited about this. But just maybe piggybacking on Adam, say something about the civil society element. Say something about reinforcing the hope of democracy. And part of that comes through actual prosecutions. It actually comes through holding people visibly accountable so that even in democracies where they go through a lot of the paces of democracy in Africa, you still have rampant corruption and massive kleptocratic theft and illicit financial flows. You can see the BGFI bank situation in the Congo. And so I would also ask you, what do you need from people on the ground? We haven't talked about whistleblowers at all and the role that they play at the local level of informing you what's happening in banks around the world. Riggs Bank, you might think of, which is no longer extant. And also, just quickly to Tom's point earlier, the first thing that flashed into my head was Robert Mercer, Steve Bannon, SCL Group, and Cambridge Analytica. When you see supposedly good money suddenly being turned towards very bad ends. I'll leave that there, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Do we have any other questions from the room? Stan?
Good morning, and thank you very much to all the panelists. Just looking a little bit forward and anticipating what may end up being, in some parts of the world, something of an economic recession, looking what already are massive supply chain shocks and huge bouts of inflation across large parts of the developing world, the global north, and then flowing around the world even further. My question is, are there economic opportunities that we could or should be grabbing onto in the next 3 months, 6 months, or a year that really address this problem from an economic side? Are there opportunities to buy something low or sell it high, or opportunities to press on governments in times of stress and anxiety as they may be looking at new policies to address economic shocks and challenges that maybe might not exist in times of otherwise economic stability? Just curious if that's something that's come up in the research of the work, or if there are people in the space who are advocating, saying, now in this time of semi-crisis, here's a piece we should be trying to push on now because we might not have as much traction when the waters are smoother. Thank you.
Great, and we'll start with Isabella, then Adam, then Oliver.
Thanks, Bridget. In answer to your question, no, we have not looked at that, but that sounds really interesting and something that should be looked at more broadly. To the disinformation point, I'm in no way an expert on it, and I think Adam and Oliver have covered it enough. But I think something that we have been thinking about a little bit in the disinformation space is how the cost of living crisis could be weaponized by these types of regimes to influence different conversations or to move focus away from things like fighting corruption and place just move societal focus onto other issues that could be very emotive. So that is something that I think is interesting in this space. On civil society, I think in our work we really find that civil society has a huge role to play in combating transnational corruption, both in the US and the UK as highlighting those countries as destination countries, but absolutely in the first mile where money is leaving. I think in our paper, we make a range of recommendations around really ensuring that civil society actors are protected in the very important work that they do. It would be great to see the creation of funds that could be used to sort of protect actors from prosecution and some of the sort of erroneous lawsuits that they go through. We would also, to your point about whistleblowers, I mean, the UK has a long way to go on its whistleblower protections, and we really do encourage the government to look at how you could emulate some of the strengths of the US system when it comes to whistleblowers in the UK as well. Of course, that doesn't address some of the problems in originator countries, but I think the US and the UK do have a considerable role to play in capacity building and helping as much as they can in educating on international standards, on supporting journalistic communities and civil society to identify and, where possible, send maybe some of that information back to the US and the UK, who can then use it maybe for sanctions designations or other investigations that can really have a big impact in those countries.
Adam?
Yeah, those are all very, in some respects, very good sort of capstone questions. Turning to the crisis first, or the economic crisis, I think you're right that the questioner is right that I think there are some potential opportunities to leverage this crisis. And I say that not because I've got any great ideas, because I'm not sure that I do, but rather because others are going to. Right, those who sort of want to weaponize this, as Isabella said, are already doing that. Right, so Putin is already weaponizing cost of living increases and sort of using it to sort of try to get a rally around the flag to sort of drive his people astray and sort of say that, well, your problems you're having economically, jobs, etc., are not my fault. It's not the fault of the unjust war in Ukraine, but rather it's the fault of these unjust sanctions and the unjust sort of response to it. Similarly, countries like China and others that are sort of gone around the world and sort of provided loans at sort of interesting interest rates with interesting sort of ability to sort of oversee and maintain and outstay their welcome will use this opportunity, I think, to double down on Belt and Road and other sorts of sort of provisions of funds in order to sort of take advantage of sort of their relative sort of wealth compared to much of the world in which they're sort of leveraging their funds. So I do think it's important to do that. I don't necessarily know how, other than perhaps to say that many jurisdictions around the world are going to be looking for funds and looking for help. And if the US, the UK, the West is able to sort of provide those funds with some conditionality perhaps associated with kleptocracy, some conditionality associated with making sure that funds are protected or otherwise, I think there's at least a potential there. With respect to the human rights component, you're 100% right that the human component here of kleptocracy is often forgotten. It's sort of, you're sort of shocked by the number of zeros we're talking about, and you're forgetting about the people and the mouths that need to be fed. That being said, I do think, at least in some cases, the link is very explicit. The Magnitsky Sanctions Act, for example, this U.S. Sanctions Act, which is actually known as a human rights sanction from a U.S. perspective, it's now become globalized, is actually not just human rights and corruption. Right. So, and I haven't looked at the exact numbers, but I'm assuming, and I would think it's probably about 50-50. In other words, the number of entities that have been sanctioned for human rights abuses and for human rights and corruption abuse. In other words, there's a linkage there that, at least from a policy perspective, is there. But I agree with you that I think the more we sort of can focus on the individual impact, in some respects, I think the better off we'll be. And perhaps the only way we can sort of break through that sort of information logjam that is challenging to sort of get through in much of the world. And we focus on China and Russia, but it isn't just China and Russia. You're seeing India do the same thing with Twitter. Of course, much of the Middle East is sort of has an information ban on it as well. And the ability for people to have sort of internet kill switches now in a lot of the world is very, very troubling in order to sort of get through that information space and sort of help people and tell people what they need. But that, I think, is going to be a real challenge sort of on a going forward basis.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to all that. I suppose if any country does need an element of an economic stimulus plan, making weapons for the Ukrainians is always going to work, and I'm sure they'll be very gratefully received. On the role of civil society, I mean, I couldn't agree more about the human rights aspect, obviously. it is an absolutely crucial component to why kleptocracy is terrible, is the fact that these regimes are invariably so grotesquely abusive of their own citizens. But on the front of civil society, I suppose the issue is about trying to maintain society's focus. Kleptocrats can afford to pay people to maintain focus. They have lots of people who work on their behalf who are amply and well remunerated to maintain the focus of not doing anything about kleptocracy. So civil society's role is to represent all the victims of kleptocracy, to try and maintain focus in an opposite direction. There is a theory that democracy is not the rule of the majority at all, but the rule of the committed minority. And I suppose our job is to try and prove that theory wrong. Obviously, there is a majority that would be in favor of ending kleptocracy, an overwhelming majority. But there's just a very wealthy and committed minority who think otherwise. So, civil society's job is to try and represent the people who aren't represented, the people who don't get a vote in our countries because they are in Nigeria or Angola or Russia or wherever, and to try and keep that in the focus of politics and the focus of the media. And if we can keep doing that, then sooner or possibly later we'll win.
Thank you all very much for this great conversation. We will end on that optimistic note. Much work lies ahead, but there is hope and there is opportunity for the transnational cooperation on these issues. We'd like to thank our panelists for their contributions to this field as well as to this discussion. And to close today's program, we'll turn to Melissa Ayton, a senior program officer with NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies, for some concluding remarks. Melissa, over to you.
Great. Just wanted to quickly thank the panelists and Bridget for this really dynamic conversation. It's highlighted several key points that we're very keen on at the Endowment. One is making sure that we consistently and repeatedly talk about how kleptocracy is not specific to Russia. It's a global problem. Kleptocratic networks operate everywhere, including in our own open countries. It's also highlighted the ways that kleptocracy impacts democracy and governance globally. We didn't talk too much about how kleptocracy impacts the so-called source countries, the authoritarian settings where it starts. But there's a lot to unpack in terms of the way that it fuels repression, human rights abuses, and then, the obvious socioeconomic underdevelopment that we all think about when we think about kleptocracy. In open settings, where I think we're just starting to unpack the ways that it impacts democracy here. So, it definitely skews political debate. It impacts our economies and, poses a national security risk that needs to be highlighted a bit more. As a representative of NED, I'm obviously very glad that the conversation came around to the role of civil society and investigative journalism in exposing kleptocracy. There in DC tends to be there is a tendency to focus on the policy responses, but it's just so important to emphasize that without the really brave civil society activists and investigative journalists operating in extremely tough environments, we wouldn't know what's going on in these places and their role in kleptocracy and undermining our democracy. So part of our response to transnational kleptocracy simply must include components for providing support for those activists. Lastly, just, it's been said over and over again that this moment in time is a pretty unique one in terms of the really bright spotlight it's placed on fighting kleptocracy. It will be incredibly vital in the coming period to explain kleptocracy to new audiences and to develop responses that go beyond sanctions. To that end, I'm really excited to announce that we at the Forum are kicking off a new kleptocracy-related newsletter next week. So, keep an eye out for that or get in touch if you'd like to subscribe. Thanks again to Bridget, Adam, Oliver, and Isabella, and thanks to RUSI for being such excellent co-sponsors for today's discussion. And see you next time. Bye.